Welcome to Kevin's Blue Ribbon Baking and Canning. I'm your host, Kevin Holland, and I'm really excited and glad you're here today because we are going to get started on our new show about getting started with Starter. First of all, before we even get into the process of beginning your starter, using it, we have to discuss the most important thing you have to think about, and that is giving your starter a name. So this morning, I'd like to introduce you to Ivanka. She's been with me about 3 years now, and it's been a great relationship. So before you get on your journey, make sure that you think of a good name because you're going to have your starter hopefully with you for many years. We've got a lot of topics to talk about on today's show, so I'm going to refer to my notes. We're going to talk about starter, what it is, how do you make it, what equipment you need, how do you know it's ready to use, how much do you need to keep on hand, how do you store it, and then finally how you use it. And we'll talk about more specifically how to use it on our next show. We're actually going to be doing some sourdough baking. So right off the bat, let's talk about starter, what it is. Starter is nothing more than a simple combination of flour, equal parts water, mixed together. That's all it is. And starter produces yeast by using a naturally occurring yeast that is in the atmosphere and in the flour itself. And over time, that yeast feeds on the flour and grows, and that's what becomes your leavening agent. When your starter begins to grow, and you see the difference here, this is a representative amount of starter that you might start out with. This is this is my storage amount I keep in the refrigerator. And then here's Ivanka after she's been fed about 12 hours earlier. The feeding process simply involves taking the starter that you have, that you're going to use for your recipe, using that amount of starter, let's say 300 grams. Whatever you have left is called your discard. Normally, this discard would go back into your storage container and you'd use for the next time. If you have more than you need for your storage, then the term discard is people throw it away. And we'll talk about not doing that because sourdough discard can be used for many different recipes. We'll talk about that later in the show. When we're making it, this is the growth that you're looking for. The starter typically will grow 2 to 3 times the amount that you begin with. So for instance, if I have 150 grams and I feed 150 grams equal of flour, 150 grams of water, 150 grams of starter, that'll give me 450 grams total. I can use 300 for the recipe, for example, and now I have 150 left over. If you're going to begin your starter from scratch, just mixing the flour and water together, keep in mind that it's a long process. It's going to take about 3 weeks before you get your starter up and active and bubbly. So plan ahead. Now, can you do something that will take less time? Yes, you can. You can do like I did when I began my journey. I ordered some starter from King Arthur, the King Arthur website. You get a small amount of starter in the mail. You'll be able to build that starter up in about a week and it'll be ready to bake. Another quick way to get started, if you're lucky enough, is to have a friend that does sourdough baking or a local bakery. You may be able to go over to them and borrow some sourdough discard. You can build your starter up that way, and you'll be able to bake within 24 to 48 hours. So those are some options as far as getting started. What equipment do you need? It's very simple. The biggest item that you need is some type of a glass clear container. You're going to do your sourdough starter mixer in the container. Here's one that I have that I keep Ivanka in for storage in the refrigerator. You notice this has an airtight lid. It's not necessary. All you need to do is have a finger tight lid on whatever you're using to store and use your starter. This is a plastic bowl that I use for mixing up my starter. As far as other equipment you need, again, we talked about measuring. We talked about using equal amounts of water, equal amounts of flour. So in order to do that, you need to have a good, reliable digital scale. You want to be exact and precise as you can. You'll take your starter amount, let's say 150 grams, then you'll measure that in with equal amounts of water, equal amounts of flour. So you want to make sure you keep that ratio very, very close to 100% as you can. How do you know when once you've made your starter up? How do you know it's ready to use? You should look from your original starter mix after you feed it. You should look for about a 2 to 3 times rise. As the yeast feeds on the flour, it'll create the gas, the mixture will bubble up and rise. That's how you know it's ready to go. You can also notice if you pick up the container, it'll have rather a unique, some people refer to it as a nail polish smell, but that's the acetone in the starter. That'll tell you also that it's ready to go. How much starter do you need to keep? We talked about storage. How much starter do you need to keep around? I can tell you what I do. Typically, I'll look at recipes that usually call for 200 to 300 grams of starter. So I know I need that in my recipe, and I'm going to need some to put back in storage. So I mix up 150 grams of starter, 150 grams of water, 150 grams of flour. I'll mix those up, have it come up to a rise, use 300 grams as an example. That next gives me 150 grams to keep for storage. Anything over that amount is typically what we call discard, and that's where you would throw it away. But you don't really want to do that because there are a tremendous number of great recipes that you can use your sourdough discard for. For example, crackers, fritters, all kinds of stuff. So don't waste that sourdough discard. We're going to give you some links in the comment section later in the video that you can go to look at ideas and recipes to use your sourdough starter. So whatever you do, make sure that you don't throw that discard away and experiment with different recipes. We've built up the starter. We've got it ready to use. We've used it in recipe. Now, what do we do to store the starter? We've got to keep around. As mentioned, I've had Ivanka for about 3 years. The best way to do this is store in the refrigerator. Take your last remaining amount of starter that you have after the recipe. Go ahead and put it in a glass container. Put it in the refrigerator. What that does is that keeps the yeast activity to a minimum, and that way you'll be able to keep your starter without feeding it for about 2 to 3 months. The other great option that you have is to go ahead and take some of your sourdough discard, spread it out on parchment paper, wax paper, or if you're lucky enough to have a dehydrator, you can use that. Go ahead and dry it out, spread it out real thin, dry it out, and then as you can see, I've kind of processed this in a food processor. With the dry starter, all you need to do is take equal amounts of the dry starter, flour and water, give it several days for the dry starter to absorb the water, give it several days, and it'll be back up and active before you know it. Now, we discussed storing your sourdough starter in the refrigerator. So obviously, at some point, you have to take it out of the refrigerator to feed it. So that's when you take it out of the fridge, you go ahead and add equal amounts of starter, flour, and water. You mix it in your large mixing jar, and then you look for that 12-hour period where you're going to get 2 to 3 times for the rise in volume. At which time, now you're ready to use the starter for baking. You take whatever is left over after you use your recipe, go ahead and put it back into your storage container, put it back in the refrigerator. Now our next topic is how do we actually use the sourdough starter? You can use the sourdough starter for any particular yeasted bread that you want, whether you're doing a specific sourdough loaf or any type of bread at all. The only difference is that you're going to have slightly longer proofing and rising time if you do use the starter versus commercial yeast. We're going to demonstrate the actual use of the starter on our next show. We're going to bake up some sourdough loaves. So I'm looking forward to that. I'd like to thank everybody for stopping by today. I hope you learned a lot about sourdough starter, maybe more than you needed to know, but these tips will definitely help you get you going on your journey and keep your starter with you for many years. So now it's the time of the show that we've all been waiting for. I have a, I have a beautiful Wilburn's cranberry bread. This is a quick bread and it's very easy to make. It is absolutely delicious. And I will post this link to the recipe in the comments section, and I highly recommend you try it. So for today's taste test, of course, we're going to have the Wilbur's cranberry bread with a beautiful cranberry peach top jam. Looks delicious. Let's try it. That's really good. You absolutely have to try this recipe. It's delicious. So folks, that's it for the show. On our next show, we'll be doing some sourdough baking. Please tune in. I know you'll be very excited. I know I am. So until then, may all your loaves rise and all your jars seal. See you next time.